So, I'm going to talk to you about a particular moment in Parisian food history. And this is a moment after the restaurant became one of the great attractions of Paris, and the whole idea of a restaurant was associated with Paris. And then all kinds of other eateries began to open, partially because some people couldn't afford these fancy new restaurants but still wanted to eat well, partially because more and more workers were working within Paris or on the other side of it, but living outside the walls of Paris because it was then walled. And then you also had the separate issue of women entering the workforce, and they had particular needs as well. This is largely a 19th century history. But I'm going to start in the late 18th century because that is where the roots of much of this lie. Notably, in 1767, the very first restorer opened. This first place was on the Rue des Poulies, which today is the Rue de Louvre. This is generally considered the first restaurant. It was not called a restaurant at the time. It was a health food outlet that served restorative bouillons called restaurants. And you'll hear all kinds of myths about the first restaurant, which I've addressed elsewhere. But one thing is true. Because it was like a cafe for restaurants, it had an elegance which previously had only been associated with cafes, which often had marble tables and gilt mirrors and other nice touches. And now the first restorer had these and also sold some light food options. So the idea that an eatery should be elegant first appeared because in the past nobody talks about the great cabarets or traiteurs being particularly good-looking places. And then, of course, the very term restaurant, which would take some time to be associated with the actual place, became established, and a number of imitators opened up and became very popular. So the traiteurs, who really were the ancestors of today's restaurants and had been serving good meals in public for over a century at this point, they wanted in on this fad, so they began to call themselves traiteurs-restaurateurs, and to actually sell restaurants, which they would not do for long because that was really a fad, a kind of health food fad we're very used to today. Not surprising that it existed in the 18th century as well. Now, in 1785, the Duke d'Orléans upgraded his royal palace, Palais Royal, to a kind of upscale mall where you could actually buy a space and open a dressmaker or a jewelry store. We actually have price lists for some of the places. And one of the first places to open there was a cafe called the Café de Chartres, because the Duc d'Orléans was also the Duc de Chartres. We will return to the Café de Chartres. But then we get up to the Revolution, and you begin to get the first really grand restaurants. You will hear it said, and it was said within decades of all this, that the restaurant became popular because the aristocratic chefs were put out of employment by the Revolution. This is not entirely wrong, but it's also true that just before the Revolution, at least one aristocratic chef had struck out on his own and opened his own place. To some degree, it was just the spirit of the times. And by 1789, the first really famous restaurant was Meot, M-E-O-T, which was near the Palais Royal, but not in it, on the Rue des Bons Enfants. This was a very popular place. Meot had indeed been an aristocratic chef. He was the chef for the Prince of Condé, which is about as close to royalty as you could get without actually being royal. And his place would stay open for about 13 years, and then he actually went back to serving kings and such. Among his customers were the revolutionaries, people like Danton and Robespierre, and one man wrote rather bitterly in his diary that while people were lining up trying to get bread, the revolutionary leaders were eating at these big fancy restaurants. Another man who had been the cook for the Count of Provence, who was Louis XVI's brother and would later be Louis XVIII, Beauvilliers. He opened a restaurant in the Palais Royal and did very well, but he had the regrettable idea of continuing to host aristocrats, and that ultimately became dangerous, so he left Paris for a while, probably to London. Two brothers named Véry opened a place in the Palais Royal. Véry's would remain one of the top places in Paris well past the middle of the century. They also, for a while, opened a place at the Tuileries. And they were not, so far as we know, aristocratic chefs at all. Now, we have very few images of these early restaurants because, for whatever reason, people didn't think to note them. But luckily for us, a man got murdered. We food historians are a cold-blooded lot. And this man, Le Pelletier de Saint-Fargeau, was very rich, but he chose to eat in one of the lesser places in the Palais Royal, a place called Février, so that he didn't show off his wealth too much, and that was where he was killed. And there were a number of magazine articles on his assassination. Some showed a fairly simple place, and it's been suggested that was because they didn't want to show a revolutionary leader eating in the finer places, but some showed beautiful paintings on the walls and sculpted moldings. And if you look outside, you see the entrance with a little counter, which is quite typical. It had always been true of cafes and now became true of restaurants, where a woman, usually the owner's wife, would collect the money as you were going out. So we do have some sense of how fancy these first restaurants could be. We get to the start of the 19th century. Napoleon takes power, and Napoleon does not discourage luxury. If anything, he encouraged luxury. And a little mysteriously, after years of war, a number of people had become very rich. So there was a lot of money around for these big, fancy restaurants. Beauvilliers returned to Paris and opened not in the Palais Royal, it was probably full up by then, but right nearby on the Rue de Richelieu, which at this point was known as the Rue de la Loi, the street of the law. And he opened both a hotel and a cafe known as the Tavern of London. If you think it's strange that a fancy French restaurant should be called an English tavern, well, consider that the first great food critic, Grimaud de la Reynière, in explaining why the restaurant had been so successful, includes the fact that the French were always fascinated by the English, and he says, as everyone knows, the English always dine at the tavern. He also recognized the earlier place on the Rue des Poulies, so it's a complex question, but it does show that some French people of the time connected these first great restaurants with English taverns. An Englishman named Francis Blagden left us a wonderful work called Paris as It Was and As It Is, and if Paris Before and After the Revolution interests you, this is your book. It's on Google Books. And among other things, he tells his English readers about these new French restaurants. And he explains what they are, basically taking a text from Le Grand Dossier, whose erroneous explanation has endured for centuries. And then he focuses in on Beauvilliers, which is very convenient for us, partly because Beauvillier's place was one of the top restaurants, but also because it was very typical of the other great restaurants of the time. And he describes it on the first floor of a large hotel formerly occupied perhaps by a farmer general. You enter a suite of apartments decorated with arabesques and mirrors of large dimensions in a style no less elegant than splendid, where tables are completely arranged for large or small parties. In winter, these rooms are warmed by ornamental stoves and lighted by quinquet, a species of Argan's lamp. They are capable of accommodating from 250 to 300 persons. And then he goes on to say that in warmer seasons there are less people. Now this is pretty typical of the descriptions of the great restaurants. There's a similar description for Véry's place at the Tuileries. And then he describes the menu, which was very similar to menus for the other great restaurants. It will require half an hour at least to con over this important catalog. Let us see. Soups, 13 sorts. Hors d'oeuvre, 22 species. Beef, dressed in 11 different ways. Pastry, which meant anything in dough, so largely pies, containing fish, flesh, and fowl in 11 shapes. Poultry and game, under 32 various forms. Veal, amplified into 22 distinct articles. Mutton, confined to 17 only. Fish, 23 varieties. Roast meat, game, and poultry of 15 kinds. Entremets, or side dishes, to the number of 41 articles. Dessert, 39. Wines, including those of the liqueur kind, of 52 denominations, besides ale and porter. Liqueurs, 12 species, together with coffee and ices. If you're wondering what all this looks like on an actual menu, well, he reproduces Beauvillier's menu. And here's the first page, here's the second page, the third page, the fourth page, the fifth page, the sixth page, the seventh page, the eighth page, and the ninth. It was very long, as were a number of the menus for the first great restaurants. Now, you might be asking yourself, did they really have all these foods? Apparently not always. There seems to have been a marketing aspect to listing all these things as available. What about the portions? Some people remember when Nouvelle Cuisine first came along, complaints that you would get this huge plate with just a little food on it. And Blagden warns you that a pompous French name can hide a few pieces on a plate. It is, he said, as if the mountain birthed a mouse. So really you want to think of these dishes as tapas plates or maybe grazing plates. Now, Beauvilliers also left one of the great cookbooks of the 19th century. So if you're a cook, you can look at the menu, pick out some dishes, and then go to his cookbook and prepare your friends a meal from one of the first great restaurants in Paris. Here we have a look at Madame Véry at her counter. There's another image of that around. And then below, there was a very famous cafe called the Thousand Columns, Mille Colonnes, which was also in the Palais Royal. And here you have the limonadière. So cafes are actually called lemonade vendors, limonadier. And the beautiful limonadière was the woman who took the money at the Mille Colonnes. We have at least two menus for Véry. One is probably the oldest menu we have for a French restaurant. We know it's from the Revolutionary period, around 93, 94, because the Palais Royal here is called the House of Equality, the Maison Égalité. And as you can see, it's a little scattered, but then we get to 1810, and we have this very dense menu. It's one sheet, but it's in very small print. So really, you've got almost as many offerings here as for Beauvilliers. There were some men who came up from Provence and opened a place called the Provençal Brothers. It's not sure that they were brothers, but the Frères Provençaux were definitely from Provence. As you can see, they had a fairly fancy place, and we have a menu for them as well. Now, Février, where Le Pelletier got assassinated, now became Borel's, and Borel had a cute little trick. Apparently, it was a good mimic, and also he had tubes running through his establishment, and if you asked for a friend, he would imitate that friend's voice, which would come out from some unexpected place, and you go running after to find your friend who was not there. And so some people called Borel's Cafe the ventriloquist, and here we have some English people in the ventriloquist, or at Borel's. Meanwhile, the first great market in Paris, Les Halles, had grown bigger and bigger, and so now the oyster market was on a neighboring street called the Rue Montorgueil, which is still there and still a wonderful place to visit. Some of the best oysters came from a place called the Rock of Cancale, and a restaurant on the Rue Montorgueil, the Rocher de Cancale, was known for its oysters and then known for its food, and soon known for its clientele, which came to include Russian counts and some famous writers, notably Balzac, who mentions it in some of his novels. Towards the middle of the century, another man would buy it and move it to the other side of the Rue Montorgueil. It remained one of the top restaurants in Paris for quite a while, and then towards the end of the 19th century declined. But at the start of the 20th century, it was well known enough for Atget to take a photograph of it. Today, you can still go there, and as you can see, they've redone the outside much as in Atget's photo. The inside is really just a neighborhood restaurant. You can go there and have a steak and potatoes and take great joy in the fact that you are eating what used to be one of the very best restaurants in Paris. The Palais Royal would continue to host some of the very best restaurants in Paris forever, really, but it did decline overall as time went on. And if you look at this image, you can see that the arcades actually have advertisements painted on them, which would be unthinkable today. Usually these were for the neighboring places, I think. If you can make it out about halfway down, there's one for an American cafe, Café Américain. And among other things, you now had posters around the Palais Royal for traiteurs, but the traiteurs were not the traiteurs restaurateurs, they were just traiteurs, and they advertised 22 sous meals. So you could get a full meal for a set price apparently a reasonably good one, so long as you didn't ask for any of the more exotic specialties they advertised in the posters, in which case you would be told they had just sold the last one. Some of these traiteurs also hosted table d'hôte, host tables. Now, the table d'hôte go back to the late 16th century, when some inns would offer meals to their guests at a collective table. You'd pay a set price and get whatever was served to you. This is the origin of one myth about the original restaurant, which was that it supposedly was the first place where you could eat with your friends and not have to sit at a collective table. But in fact, lots of options of that sort existed before the restaurant. The table d'hôte was just one way of dining out. And it continued into the 19th century. Apparently, these were fairly fancy, and the people who went there were often very well dressed, the women very beautiful, but a newcomer was well advised to steer clear of them because the men were hustlers and the women had other ways of getting money out of newcomers. So, under the old regime, a cafe could distill its own liqueurs. Many were distillers. It often sold ice cream, and of course they had coffee and lemonade, but they could not sell beer or wine, which were the province of other businesses. Now, if you're the kind of person who can live on liqueur and ice cream, and I'm sure you know who you are, well, then you might have survived eating in a cafe, but generally they weren't places to eat. You got to the 19th century, and now they could serve any alcohol they wanted and did, and meals, and cafes became often one economical option for having a simple meal. But some were not all that simple, and so there was one in the Palais Royal called the Café d'Orléans. An Englishman who ate there found this a very high-priced bill. Note that the wine and the fruit, which is probably the dessert, were the most expensive items, and that the roast beef and the peas cost the same thing. And he found all this very expensive at 11 francs 70 centimes. He probably ate in a place that looked like this, which is much like the older cafes used to look, very fancy. One cafe which had become very popular and then went up, declined, it was popular for a while with foreigners, was the Café de Chartres. And sometime before 1817, a man named Véfour bought the Café de Chartres. It became alternately known as the Café de Chartres or Véfour, even after he sold it. It would have many ups and downs through the decades. At one point, it actually bought Very's, so it became the heir to two great French restaurants. But it has lasted all the way to the current day with some interruptions. And as you can see, Véfour still advertises its origin in the Café de Chartres. It has the best documented claim to being the oldest restaurant in Paris. Now note I say documented because there's lots of other places that claim to be older, but the most firm basis is for Véfour's claim. In the old regime, a tavern was a wine shop. The word tavern or taverna actually means shop. And so were cabarets. Cabarets were also considered wine shops. You could actually go there and buy wine. You get to the 19th century, and now you just have wine shops, marchands de vin, which often sold meals. And so here we have what is probably a very old wine shop because of the grill work in the window, which is more of a 17th century feature. As you see, it says commerce des vins, wine trade, and then on the other side, restaurant. And here we have another place that says commerce des vins and then restaurant below it. And this place is actually called the Tour d'Argent. Now, it is not the Tour d'Argent you may have heard of, which was located at a completely different place because there were several places called the Tour d'Argent. But this was, again, a wine shop. It was also a restaurant. Some of them became very well-known restaurants. So if you look in the Paris directory, which existed since the end of the 18th century, there's one place where you keep seeing wine shop, wine shop, wine shop, and this was on the Rue Montorgueil below a boulevard. So you had this one little piece of the Rue Montorgueil which is cut off from the rest of it. And then suddenly it is a wine shop known for its oysters, which were probably a reflection of the other part of the Rue Montorgueil, and snails. And it's also a restaurant. And then the next thing you know, there's a restaurant there called The Snail, Restaurant de l'Escargot, with a big golden snail outside it. And today, you can still go to l'Escargot on the Rue Montorgueil, parallel to the Rue Saint-Denis. So it has a long history, and by all evidence, it began as a wine shop. You still had some actual cabarets. This was on the Ile de la Cité before it was torn down and redone, because by the 19th century, the Ile de la Cité, which is the island where Notre Dame sits, was a really crowded island with something like 16,000 people living in really close quarters. And the White Rabbit, Le Lapin Blanc, was a very famous cabaret. You see the stove in the middle with a big pipe going up the middle. But most of the cabarets that survived at this point were outside Paris, very working class. And we had Mother Marie's Cabaret outside the city walls. This is very much like an 18th century cabaret, except for how people are dressed. And the man who wrote the article that goes with this picture says that people are more likely to eat bread and onions here than they were steak. Now, in the 18th century, you began to get these cabarets, which were outside the city walls, called ganguettes. They were very working class, often dance halls as well. But upper class people liked to go there, and because they were outside the city walls, they weren't subject to various taxes, which meant they were cheaper places. Then the city walls expanded and they were included. One of the most famous was a place called Rampenot, which disappeared as the city expanded. But then in the 19th century, you had a place up near where the flea market is today called the Little Rampenot, Le Petit Rampenot, which, as you can see, had a huge kitchen. Apparently, there were two parts to the Le Petit Rampenot. One was for people who really couldn't afford much, and then this was probably the part for the people who had somewhat more money. But it was a very lively place. And this apparently began as a drink stand, so it had a very modest start and became this huge, well-known restaurant. Now, with all these workers who needed to eat in Paris and didn't live in Paris, you began to get various options for them, including basically workers' restaurants. Down by the Boulevard Montparnasse, which at this point was right along the southern walls of Paris, it's pretty deep into Paris today, there was a place called the California, La Californie. La Californie was said to be like a big wooden structure in the American West. It was all built of wood. The tables were of wood. You ordered your food at the counter and paid for it. You could order wine while you were seated. And supposedly La Californie served thousands of people from morn until night. So it was a very new idea of a huge, cheap restaurant for the working class. The original market, Les Halles, had been founded around a graveyard called the Cemetery of the Innocents. At the end of the 18th century, that was filled in, and a market was established there called the Market of the Innocents, to the great amusement of people who knew there was a lot of prostitution in that area. So here we have an image of the Marché des Innocents with the Fountain of the Innocents, which you can still see today, right in the middle. Now it's over to the side. By the way, I used to date a woman who claimed that she and her friends used to climb up into one of the pillars of the Fountain of the Innocents. I doubt you can get away with that today. And then you see all these umbrellas down at the bottom. These were open-air restaurants. And one of the women who ran one of the most famous open-air restaurants was called Madame Robert, and she would sell people a little bouillon with a little beef and bread and wine for a very modest sum. And supposedly when she knew somebody was down on their luck, she would actually front them a meal or two along with their family. So she was very revered in the area. Now, a writer claims that she too used to serve thousands of people a day. I have trouble doing the math there, but that claim has been made. Here's another open-air restaurant. But these are not the bottom of the barrel. There were lower grade options for the really poor, like rag pickers, who were some of the poorest workers in Paris. And one is so outlandish that it has been claimed that it was satire or myth, but at least two people write about it, and one American claims to have seen it. And this was a place where there was a big vat, and you would pay a very small sum to plunge a long fork into the vat and hope you got some meat. If you missed, you got a second chance, and you had to pay again. And this American claims that the people who did this loved the gambling aspect of this so much they didn't really care about the food. But that was one way the very poor ate. There was another place where there was a long wooden table with bowls cut into the table, and then women went around with vats, and they would take something like a turkey baster or a syringe and take bouillon out, put it into your bowl. You were supposed to pay then. If you didn't, they took the bouillon right back out. Otherwise, they gave you some meat and bread and an iron fork and spoon. One of the most outlandish options is actually very well documented and goes back to the 18th century. Vendors would go around to the back doors of big houses and buy the leftovers from aristocratic tables. So you could literally get a piece of steak with some creme brulee on it, and that would go into the collection. That continued into the 19th century, and these first collections were called jewels, bijoux, and the people who sold them were called bijoutiers. And then they would take them to Les Halles, where vendors would buy them and repackage them as harlequins for obvious reasons. And we actually have a photograph of this dealer in harlequins. If you weren't a germaphobe, and not many people in 19th century Paris were, you could eat the very same food and maybe even some of the bodily fluids of the very great and rich. Paris has always had street food going back to the Middle Ages, and then after Parmentier introduced the potato, very quickly you got people selling fried potatoes, and these were originally just little discs. It would be a very long time before you got the French fried potato, which appears to have been invented in France, but maybe simultaneously in Belgium. I'm not going to solve that quarrel, but there's evidence on both sides. The French also loved fried food in general. This is one bad taste for which they cannot blame Americans. And so you had marchands de friture, of fried goods. And here you see a woman, she's carrying her stove in front of her, so you really didn't want to trip. And then you see she's got a big loaf of bread because she would actually give her customers some bread with, well, whatever she sold them. Now, there's an American who described such a woman as a locomotive cook. I mean a woman with an appareil de cuisine about her neck, having meat and fish hung by hooks on both her haunches, and sausages, or fish, or potatoes, hissing in a frying pan and diffusing for 20 yards around a most appetizing flavor. She haunts usually the Pont Neuf and its vicinity and looks like gastronomy personified. She will give you for 4 sous of potatoes with yesterday's Gazette, and reclining under the parapet of the quay, you eat a wholesomer dinner at 10 sous than the Place Sorbonne at 24. That was one option, and they already had chestnut vendors. The first chestnut vendor in New York in 1828 was a Frenchman whose passing would later be noted. There were a lot of so-called foreigners in Paris, meaning in the 19th century often people from other regions in France. And these included the Auvergnats, who did some of the hardest, lowest work in the period. They were sometimes called Bouillons. It doesn't seem to have been pejorative. And if you just said go to the Bouillons, you often meant go to the coal cellars because they often ran coal outlets. And a number of them opened wine shops along with the coal, or even cafes. Here we have, you can see the old sign of Café Vin Charbon, meaning coal, but then a very modern sign, because this Café Chalbon, which was a term that appeared later for these coal cellar cafes. This one is now on the Rue Oberkampf, if it has survived the pandemic, and it's on the premise of an old Café Chalbon. Now, with all these women who were working in town, many of them did not want to go to cafes, which were essentially bars. One option was for them to go to a creamery. A creamery is exactly what you might think it would be. They sold milk and butter and cream, and then bouillon and coffee, and so a woman could go there, and this is one of the larger ones because sometimes they're really just little holes in the wall, and have a very light meal very comfortably and safely. Here's another ad for a cremerie, rather cute one. And over time, some of these cremeries developed into full-on restaurants. The most famous of these is a restaurant that is often known as that restaurant in Woody Allen's Midnight in Paris, which is Polydor. As you can see, Polydor today still advertises that it was once a cremerie. But one of the most famous in the time belonged to a woman named Madame Busque, and Madame Busque had a lot of American clients. So she learned to make pumpkin pie. And probably this is the first pumpkin pie sold in Paris. Arguably, hers might have been the first American restaurant in Paris, even though it was nominally French. Whistler was a big fan of Madame Busque's, but another man named Salah wrote a description of the place. We entered a very little shop on whose tiny window panes were emblazoned half-effaced legends in yellow paint relative to eggs, milk, cream, coffee, and broth at all hours. Some tall loaves were leaning up in a corner as if they were tired of being the staff of life and wanted to rest themselves. There were no eggs, broth, cream, or coffee to be seen, but there was a pleasant odor of cooking palpable to the olfactory nerves, and this was all. The round table was of simple oak, and there was no tablecloth. The chairs were straw-bottomed and exceedingly comfortable. The floor was tiled and sanded. A solitary but very large wax candle burnt in an iron candlestick. Pepper was a superfluity, so excellently seasoned were the dishes. At intervals, hands appeared, very much in the white cat fashion, and tendered sardines, olives, the mild cheese of Brie, the pungent Roquefort, and the porous Gruyere. I had as good, plentiful, clean, well-dressed a dinner as ever Brillat, Severin, or Dr. Kitchener would have desired to sit down to. So, you could eat rather well in a cremerie, and as I say, some became famous restaurants. There was a place more recently in Paris called the Cremerie, kind of a homage to these older cremeries. The menu, when I looked at it, wasn't very, very cremerie-ish. Now, to take a little detour, if you go outside Paris to a place called Sceaux, which is a very pleasant little park, very much like a mini Versailles, there was a woods nearby where people looked for huge chestnut trees. And as you can see, there's something that looks like a treehouse in this huge chestnut tree. That is, in fact, a restaurant, and it was called the Robinson, as in Swiss Family Robinson. And apparently it did well enough that other restaurants went around looking for huge chestnut trees, and for a while it had competition. But this one lasted for decades, long enough for Atget again to photograph a later incarnation of it. Not a bad idea, a restaurant in a treehouse, but it didn't seem to have lasted that long. Now, one option for workers was simply soup. And so you had these women walking around with big vats of soup, and they would give you a bowl and a spoon, and you'd stand there and you'd eat your soup. There were also outlets for bouillon, débit de bouillon. At some point, a Dutchman or his company had the idea of opening a chain of restaurants. Now, this was the first chain in Paris and probably in the world. These were said to be rather nice-looking places, and they basically served bouillon. Apparently, sometimes they served meat. And were very popular from about 1835 into the 50s. Why they didn't last, I don't know. And they ended about 1854. So here we have an ad to sell the locations and equipment of various bouillon hollandaises. But meanwhile, a butcher named Duval picked up on the idea. Now, the usual story about Duval is that he had extra meat he needed to monetize, so he thought it'd be great to open a bunch of restaurants that served bouillon and meat. But certainly the bouillon hollandaise existed before his did. He can be considered in a way the Ray Kroc of bouillon because he really made the idea popular. He had a principle very like Ray Kroc's of economy, cleanliness, and quality. And his places were very good looking. Originally, supposedly you just got a little menu that was also a bill where price would be written down next to it, and then you would take it to the counter, as was common. One of the big striking points about the Bouillon Duvals was that they had women instead of waiters, and these women were very clean and neat, and originally did not accept tips. Later on it was said they lived off tips. They were the object of much artistic interest, and they were allowed to sit down, which waiters were not. Now, Duval's Bouillon would last until the start of the 20th century. His son, Alexander, was most known for squiring around very beautiful and expensive women at one point, which may be why ultimately the chain faded. It's not sure. But meanwhile, there were a lot of imitators, notably the brothers Chartier, who mainly opened their places at the start of the 20th century. They were very handsome places. And as with the Bouillon de Val, for a long time, you were never very far in Paris from a Bouillon Chartier. One of these lasted up till the present day. When I was a student, this was just known as Chartier, and then they restored the name Bouillon Chartier more recently. It's very pretty inside, as you can kind of make out. Another was the flagship of the Chartier system, and it was called the Grand Bouillon. It was restored just a few years ago as the Bouillon Racine because it is on the Rue Racine, which is right near Polydor's. Markets had always attracted taverns and other eateries, and Les Halles was no different. So shortly before it was remodeled, there were already some big restaurants around it, notably the Tranquil Father, the Père Tranquille, and you can see from this later picture that there was quite a bit going on in the way of a market. And upstairs you would have an entertainment room for the more well-off, and downstairs is where the workers would come in at 3 or 4 in the morning and have their white wine and maybe a little snack before they got to work, and then come back later around 8 or 9 for their lunch. The Père Tranquille lasted into the 20th century. You see here various market workers with their little carts, and you can still go there today and have some coffee or even go inside and have a meal. It is one remnant of the long disappeared which were built, the pavilions, Bataille's pavilions were built for about 13 years in the middle of the century. And as you can see, they had a lot of side streets. A lot of those side streets included places to eat. One was originally known as the Little Norman Woman, La Petite Normande, but it became known as Pharamond. And you would go to Pharamond notably to have tripe in the style of Caen, which is a city in Normandy. Tripe à la mode de Caen. It was probably a pretty simple place for a while, and then in 1930 or so, it was gussied up with a kind of pseudo-Norman look. You can still go there today and have tripe de Caen. There was also a place called the Sheep's Foot, Le Pied du Mouton, which was very popular into the 30s when Cocteau and Colette ate there, and one day Cocteau was with some friends and talking loudly about how much he hated Colette's latest novel, and he went up to pay, and the waiter said, "Oh, there was a woman behind you who did not look happy," and Cocteau said, "Oh dear, I'm going to have to write a letter to dear Colette." The Pied du Mouton closed, but sometime after the Pig's Foot, the Pied du Cochon opened, and last time I went there was very late at night, and I actually ate a pig's foot, lots of bones. But in normal times, you can still eat there very late at night. There were a number of these restaurants which opened, if not necessarily in the 19th century, before the market was destroyed. And so you can walk around that area today and eat in places that will recall to you the ambiance before Les Halles were destroyed. Typically what would happen is the swells, the well-off, would go up to Montmartre, which had its own scandalous places, and maybe get a scandalized look at same-sex lovers and that sort of person and artists up in Montmartre. And then they would come down around 3 in the morning to Les Halles and enjoy looking at all the workers in their smocks coming to work. And then they would go upstairs in the upper portions where you had bands and sometimes erotic shows and dancing. For a long time, this was one of the hot spots. The market was one of the great places to go late at night. Now, we get to 1870. There is the Franco-Prussian War. Paris is besieged. There's a shortage of just about everything. And they ended up eating rats and horses and dogs and some zoo animals. Now, this is supposedly menus for Christmas from one of the great restaurants. People have claimed these menus are just jokes, but there are accounts of eating dog and rat. And in fact, even though people have been promoting eating horse before this, after the siege, horse became a standard meat in Paris. But here you see consommé d'éléphant, and there was a news item about the zoo elephant being killed. You have a cat garnished with rats, and you could buy rats in the market at one point. Things normalized after some bloodshed with the Commune. And one big after effect of the Franco-Prussian War was that France lost Alsace and Lorraine. And so lots of people fled to Paris from Metz and other cities in that area. Many were Jews, which is interesting because when Jews were driven out of France in the 14th century, many went to Metz. So that leads us to wonder if the Jews who came to Paris after 1870 were in fact descendants of the first Jews in France. These Jews were Ashkenazi, and their food was highly influenced by Germanic food. Some have claimed that much Jewish food preserves recipes of an older German style of food. In the early 20th century, you began to get Eastern European Jews in Paris, and they had a cuisine which had a more Russian or Eastern European cast. But the first Jewish food in Paris was basically Germanic Ashkenazi food. And apparently the carpe à la juive, Jewish-style carp, was particularly appreciated even by non-Jews. Now, something else that happened was Alsatian breweries began to open around Paris, and the French word for a brewery is brasserie. The Parisians actually liked the beer. It was probably better than the beer they're used to having, and these places also began to sell some food, largely, of course, Alsatian food, notably choucroute, sauerkraut, but also onion soup, which wasn't particularly Alsatian, but gives you some idea of the sort of simple, hearty meal that they were inclined to sell in these places. Notably, right after the Boulevard Saint-Germain was cut through a bunch of older streets, a man named Leonard Lipp opened what he initially called the Brasserie of the Banks of the Rhine, but of course it became known as the Brasserie Lipp even after he sold it. It developed a literary reputation later on, and then politicians began to go there, and so it's still there across from the Deux Magots and the Café Flore, which were two existentialist hangouts, and it has as much a literary reputation probably as anything else. It's not always easy to get a table there, but it has survived for a long time. There was another brasserie, which still survives today, called Beaufanger. Some claim, and I haven't been able to document this firsthand, but some claim that Beaufanger had the first tap beer in Paris. You had another kind of brasserie called a women's brasserie, a brasserie des femmes, and this was not like the Bouillons, where you had women waiting on men just to wait on them. Here you see the women are sitting with the male customers, and it's generally considered that these places were a cover for prostitution. Prostitution was very regulated, legal but very regulated in 19th century France. And so this was one way to get around the regulation and maybe do things you wouldn't have gotten away with in a legal bordello. This is supposedly a lady of the brasserie. I'm not sure how they verified that. We had another institution which goes all the way back to the 17th century when a man wrote about places where you could take your mistress, dine, and then be left alone. And probably there were already other similar places in the 17th century. At the start of the 19th century, Blagden wrote about cabinet particulier. Now, a dentist or a doctor or a lawyer could have a private room, a cabinet particulier, but here we're talking about places in restaurants where people would have absolute privacy unless they called the waiter. So these probably existed all through the 19th century, but they became particularly notable at the end, and all the best restaurants had them. There was nothing scandalous about them, even though nobody had any illusion as to what they were to be used for. One man says that nobody goes to a cabinet particulier to eat. Everybody knows this, and yet a man who goes is obliged to order from an overpriced menu all kinds of excellent delicacies which may go completely untouched, as well as chilled champagne, and he may end up with nothing more than a rustling of lace. Now, some men went with their mistresses or with women whose services could be negotiated, so it's not like nobody did anything in the cabinet particulier. Here we have a rather innocent picture, but note they're sitting together on a couch. A lot of these places had love seats. Nothing so crass as a bed, but, one could make do. And these seem to have lasted up to World War I. They're virtually unthinkable today, but back in the 80s, I went with a business colleague to a little restaurant on the side street for a drink, and he pointed to a door at the back and said, "There's a staircase here which leads right up to some rooms. Men come here with their mistresses." So it is perfectly possible that some places fulfill the same purpose in modern Paris, but they're far more discreet. Meanwhile, there were two big World's Fairs, and at one they built the Eiffel Tower, and it already had a restaurant. Now, I have eaten in the Jules Verne, which is one of the restaurants there today, and it's just lovely to sit there and look out through the girders to a glittering Paris, drinking from crystal, if somebody else is paying for it, as was my case. Christian groups, Catholic groups notably, got very concerned about the fact that women were out in cafes and such places having lunch, so they wanted to create safe spaces, as we would call them today, for women. And they opened what were called feminine restaurants. Restaurant féminin. Most were opened after the 19th century. They only lasted into the 30s. This is an early picture of one. It's a newspaper picture, so it's a little rough, but it does give you an idea of what they were like. And then from the 30s, we have this clearer picture. And as you can see, they're kind of institutional, but these women must have been very happy to have a nice, quiet, safe place where they could eat. It's rather a shame that the idea ultimately didn't last. So, in the last 2 decades of the 19th century, you begin to see a word, bistrot, spelled usually with a T, bistrot in English pronunciation. And right away that sort of knocks out the common explanation for the word, which is that it appeared when Russian soldiers would snap bistrot, meaning quickly, during 1814. This was much later, and you don't see the word before that. There is slight but strong evidence that the word originally referred to somebody who ran a wine shop. So it wasn't the place, it was the owner. And the term may, and I say may because there's really no solid documentation for this, but it may come from a regional term for a sheep herder, and in turn that would have come from goat. Beast, B-I-S-T, was a regional word for a goat, and that was derived from best, which in French became bête and in English became beast. So somebody who herded beast was a bistrot. And you can see where by extension that would have been applied to a man running a wine shop. What exactly is or was a bistrot? There's no solid definition. It does seem that a bistrot originally was just a wine shop. The same wine shops have been around forever. And this was just a slang term that appeared at the end of the 19th century for the owner. Bit by bit, it was applied to the place. And it still seems to have only meant a wine shop, but of course it began to take on the connotation of a place where you could get a good cheap meal and some reasonable wine. For a long time it had that meaning. Already in the 60s and 70s, if a place was still called a bistrot, there was a chance it had greater pretensions and was actually a little pricier. About 10 to 15 years ago, chefs in some of the better hotels wanted to open cheaper places, so they opened what they called bistrot, where you could get their food for much less than the great hotels, but not cheap. So if you go to one of those bistros, don't expect a nice, homey bargain meal. And that whole movement is called bistronomy, and I believe continues today. But what we do know is that the word first appears at the end of the 19th century. And so, as you can see, all through the 19th century, there are all these different eateries, some of which disappeared, some of which endured but with a different nature, and some of which are still with us today. If you'd like to know more about this, you can always look at my book, A History of the Food of Paris, where I cover these subjects and more about the food of Paris. And I thank you for listening.